Hello my friends and welcome back to another video. As the title suggests, today we're going to go over all of the Tarkov settings to see how they affect visibility and also frame rate. Before we dive into it though, I just want to mention it is impossible to get universally perfect settings, as Tarkov's optimization is very rough. If one setting compared to low and ultra has 20 FPS difference on shoreline, then the same setting on customs can have up to 40 or 50 frames impact around the latest expansion area, for example. Also, everything is tested in an offline raid, since online raids have too many factors that can change the frame rate during the test. And there are a few settings where I have to restart the raid, or in the case of textures, I would have to restart the game between every setting. By the time I get back into the raid, the weather, the amount of scavs and PMCs has changed, and so on. Not to mention, something as simple as someone shooting can sometimes drop your frames. So unfortunately, it just has to be done in an offline raid to get an idea of a baseline. But enough yapping, let's check out the game tab. As we all know, early wipes in Tarkov are always riddled with network issues due to the influx of new players. Fortunately, Gear Up Booster will help us deal with that. Gear Up also allows us to take advantage of less populated servers for easier raids. For example, if it's really late in the Asian servers, I can pick one of the servers from over there, from EU, and take advantage of the less contested raids due to the lower player count. Unfortunately, a lot of those servers also have set a ping limit, meaning finding one that suits you can be a little hard. That's where Gear Up Booster comes into play. Gear Up Booster's algorithms ensure that you take the shortest network transmission path, resulting in minimizing latency and helping reduce packet loss, which everybody knows has been a fairly big issue during most of the early wipes, and now with the influx of new and returning players for the 1.0 launch, will most likely happen again. Gear Up Booster is 100% safe to use. I have partnered with them before, and so have other big Tarkov creators. Check out the link in the pinned comment or the description to get yourself a free trial. Free trial can be activated by clicking the code/coupon on the homepage and entering the code FLINN. Thank you to Gear Up Booster for sponsoring today's video. Alright, and starting off in the game tab, the first few settings has no impact on your frame rate. Those are quick slots, stamina and stance, and health condition, and also the health color scheme. These are personal preference. I personally like to have my quick slots on always hidden, because I've played the game for thousands of hours. I know exactly where my first aid kits are, where my painkillers are, my splints and so on. But if you're a newer player, you might want to consider going to always shown. Stamina and stance, put it on auto hide, just because I don't want that visual clutter on the bottom left of my screen. The only time the auto hide pops it up is when I'm sprinting, when I change my movement speed. Those are the only times I really care about my stamina, and if I really want to check my stamina when I'm not sprinting, I can just use my scroll wheel, which changes my movement speed, and then it pops up again. Health and condition, I like to put it on always shown, so it pops up on the top left of my screen, and the color scheme is polychrome. Essentially what that does is if any of my limbs are slightly hurt, it comes up as yellow or reddish. But if I'm fully healthy and I have no damage to my PMC, it's fully green. And it just gives a nice visual representation of your health in the game. And I feel like it makes my life a little bit easier, especially because sometimes when you're bleeding or you have a fracture, it doesn't always show up until you take some damage. So for me, health condition always shown with polychrome as the color scheme. Rest of this is mainly personal preference here. The only thing I would like to mention is the vaulting over medium obstacles. This used to have a massive FPS drop if you went to auto, but I just tested it out and it seems to be fixed. So me personally, I like to have it on hotkey because I use my control for vaulting, but the rest of these here, completely personal preference. Automatic RAM cleaner, it does work in the game. Every single time you press escape when you have this enabled, it kind of clears your RAM, but it also gives you a little bit of a stutter when you go into the menu. And honestly, since I have 32 gigabytes of VRAM and also have a RAM cleaner already running in the background, I personally have it off. If you have 16 gigabytes of RAM, then this is probably not a bad idea to keep on, but just remember, in order for it to work, you have to press escape in the game, and sometimes it freezes a little bit. And honestly, I think it depends on the speed of your RAM and just your PC in general. So if you have a lower end PC, having this on obviously helps clear the RAM, but that little initial stutter might be a little bit longer and it does get a little bit annoying. Only use physical cores. I have not seen any performance hit or dip when using it or not using it. So once again, my personal preference here is to have it off because I just don't see any difference whatsoever. FOV does have a little bit of an impact on your frame rate. If you put it to 50, you obviously gain frames because you have less to render. But if you put it all the way up to 75, I lost about 5 to 6 frames. But also, sometimes the edges of the screen, like windows in the distance on the very edge of the screen on max FOV, it doesn't render properly. And also you have to remember that when you put the FOV to the highest, the targets on your screen become smaller. So the PMCs in CQB, in close quarters combat, they're a little bit harder to hit because they are smaller. So myself personally, I've been using 63 for years. It does come at a cost of like 3-4 frames maybe tops compared to 50, but I think it gives me the best experience in the game in terms of visuals, frame rate, and then the size of the targets, let's put it that way. Me personally, I've been using 63, and that's what I recommend the range for you as well. You can try 59, 65, but I wouldn't go with all the way up, and I definitely wouldn't go with all the way down. And head bobbing has no impact on your frame rate, but having it up obviously gives you a screen shake when you're sprinting. So turn that all the way down for the sake of visuals and being able to spot players, because if your screen is shaken, it's harder to spot enemies. Alright, and moving on to the graphics side of things, screen resolution should always be your monitor's native resolution. If you want to get more frames, do not lower your frame rate, just use either FSR or DLSS, and we'll talk about those specifically later. Aspect ratio, personal preference, I've been using 16:9 for years, but it's completely up to you. Screen mode, when I was testing this between full screen and borderless, full screen actually gave me worse frame rate, but also my GPU usage went down by like 20%, so that's probably the reason. I didn't do any extensive testing on this because I always play borderless, and I recommend playing borderless, especially if you're using wiki a lot or you're using the maps on the internet and you alt-tab a lot. Every single time you tab back into the game on full screen, it has like a 1 to 2 second delay, and I find it extremely annoying. Personal preference, my recommendation, go borderless if you alt-tab a lot. And moving on to textures, as you can see in 1.0 we got the new ultra texture. The difference between low, medium, high is fairly apparent. Obviously, as you can see, low looks kind of meh, medium looks better, and high obviously looks very good. I'll show you the difference between a high and ultra in a second, but anything above medium for me introduces a lot of lag spikes, unfortunately, and makes the game borderline unplayable on certain maps. For example, customs in firefights, my FPS drops from 100 plus to 60-70 when I'm on high. But when I switched my graphics to medium, that eliminated that for the most part. So unfortunately, I cannot recommend anything above medium at this moment. And if you have less than 8 GB of VRAM, I highly recommend stick to low. Obviously, feel free to experiment, but if you've experienced a lot of frame drops, especially in firefights, then you know that that is the main cause of the issue. And since I cannot even recommend high, then ultra is definitely out of the question at the moment. Shadows has a fairly big impact on your performance, but also on the visual side of things, ultra obviously looks the best, but compared to low, it adds a lot of extra shadows and it makes the existing shadows bigger. So for the competitive side of things, I would highly recommend go to low, just because it will be easier to spot players in the shadows specifically, and also it's a very nice frame rate boost as well. If you do want to get a little bit better frames, you can go to medium, as the difference between low and medium was around 4 to 5 frames for me personally. But like I said, my recommendation is low. I've always used low myself, and I think that's the best option. And since we're on the topic of shadows, let's talk about grass shadows. Grass shadows makes the grass look a whole lot better regardless of which setting you're using, but the performance hit does depend on the setting up here. So if you set your shadow quality to low, turning on grass shadows, the FPS impact is like 1 to 3 frames per second. So it's fairly low. If you're using ultra, for example, just to compare the two ends of the spectrum, turning on grass shadows was around 5 to 6 frames impact. So for me personally, I've been using low and I haven't been using grass shadows. But if you want that little bit of extra quality and that little bit of eye candy, I would recommend turn it on because the frame rate impact is fairly minimal. If you're already using the higher settings on the shadows, you might as well turn it on because you've already sacrificed a fair bit of frame rate for visual side of things. So you might as well go all in at that point. Object LOD quality has a fairly noticeable impact on both performance and visual side of things. The difference between object LOD quality 2 and 4 is around 15 to 14 frames. But for my testing, I've always been using 2.5. I think that's the sweet spot. You don't really have any lines of sight where you need more than that. And if you compare 2 and 2.5, you can see some of the trash piles are visible just by using 2.5. So there's really no reason to go above this in my opinion. And if you paid close attention, on top of the truck there is a backpack and a helmet. So the difference between 2 and 2.5 is whether that helmet on the truck there renders in or it doesn't render in. So my recommendation, keep it on 2.5 as it is the best option for rendering in player gear and the gear that's on the ground. And yes, it does affect the gear on the players as well. At the cost of 2 to 3 frames, you get much better visuals compared to 2. So my recommendation, 2.5 is the sweet spot and it gets the job done as you don't really have very long lines of sight where you need more than that. Moving on to overall visibility, this is one of the settings that you never want to have on 400 because it makes the game look terrible. As you can see here, some of the ground at a distance is not rendering in properly. This is eliminated at 1000 overall visibility. But if you increase it to 1500 or even 3000, you can see more stuff renders in. But from what I can see, anything above 1000 is more about rendering in landmarks, such as the skyline of Streets of Tarkov, or for example here on the Customs Bridge, you can see the cranes on shoreline. So for me personally, I like it on 1500 just because it makes it more immersive, and it doesn't really have a high FPS impact either. The difference between 400 and 1500 is like 3 frames, but also this varies from map to map. So my personal recommendation is at the minimum use 1000, never use 400, but the sweet spot for me is 1500, and anything above seems kind of pointless, and I've been using 1500 for years now. Clouds quality, I don't see any difference between low, medium and high in both frame rate or the quality of clouds, so it doesn't matter what you put it on. Since it doesn't have any impact, I just set it on low. You can put it on high and we will have the same results. The grand total of frame rate gained or lost is a big fat 0. So let's move on to anti-aliasing. And anti-aliasing can have a fair bit of an impact on your frame rate. Full disclosure though, I personally don't use anti-aliasing as I'm using Nvidia DLSS on quality, and it has a built-in anti-aliasing as well. And as you can see, it disables anti-aliasing altogether. But just for the sake of the video, let's go over it in case you don't want to use any of the upscalers. Obviously, off has the best FPS, but it looks absolutely terrible. As you can see, all the edges are very jagged and the wire in the distance doesn't look too good. FXAA does make it a little bit better. It comes at a cost of like 5 frames, which is like 3%, but it doesn't look very good. It does make it look a little bit better. So if you're looking for a more budget option for in terms of frames, then FXAA is not a bad option. But myself personally, I would recommend TAA, as it does make the edges and all that, like the wires in the distance, look a whole lot better. Compared to FXAA and TAA, the FPS difference is around 8%, so a fairly significant FPS difference. And the difference between TAA and TAA high is another extra 3%, but I also noticed TAA high is fairly unstable in terms of frame rate. The frame rate goes all over the place. So my recommendation, if you're going to use anti-aliasing, use TAA. If you want to save some frames, go with the FXAA, but just know it doesn't look the best. And moving on to Nvidia DLSS, like I said before, I always have Nvidia DLSS selected and I always use it on quality. The difference between balanced and performance is around 20 frames per second between each setting. So if I get around 230 on quality, on balanced I will get 250, on performance I will get 270 plus. But the visual degradation is very noticeable between each setting. So myself personally, I would always recommend quality. Unless you really need frames, I would not go below it. When it comes to presets, preset J and K are using the latest transformation-based model, which essentially gives you the best quality in terms of visuals. It does come at a cost of a little bit of frames, obviously, but from the visual standpoint, it also gives you the best result. The other presets are using the CNN model, which is the older model, but also, like I said, the visual side of things is worse. And comparing Nvidia DLSS on quality between preset A and K, you get around 40 frame rate difference, but also preset A gives you a whole lot of ghosting in return as well. But my recommendation will always be preset K, and I think everyone else agrees with that as well. And if you don't have an RTX card, you can also use AMD FSR. Just because it says AMD, it does not mean that you cannot use a GTX 1070, for example. I don't know how old of a card you can use here, but I'm pretty sure most GTX cards can use 2.2 at the very least, and 3.0 as well. If they ever upgrade to 4.0, I think that's when the GTX cards might not have the option. But history shows that if they add 4.0, the 3.0 will probably stay in the game and you can still use it. But the same logic applies as the Nvidia DLSS. Quality has the best quality, balanced, performance, ultra performance. The performance goes up, but the visual side of things comes down. I would never recommend going below quality once again. If you have an Nvidia RTX card, always use DLSS. DLSS is superior in every single way, especially DLSS 4 and AMD FSR 3.0. The visual side of things on DLSS is much better, but if you're forced to use FSR and you need to get some extra frames, then FSR on quality is not a bad option either. Back in the day when I had a GTX 1070, I used AMD FSR 1.0 on quality. It wasn't the best looking game, but I got more frames out of it and definitely improved the gameplay experience. HBAO has massive impact on your performance compared to off and colored ultra. Myself personally, I've always used max performance just to get that little bit more extra depth. As you can see, it adds shadows around objects. For example, you can look at the wheel of the forklift here. It makes it look a whole lot better if you go from off to max performance. And the FPS impact is around 13 frames or so, which is considerable, but it's not massive. But also the FPS difference between off and colored ultra is around 80 frames. So as you go higher, the FPS impact is fairly noticeable. I would never recommend going above high performance, which is around 5 to 6 FPS difference between max performance, but also the visual quality doesn't improve enough for me to justify that 6 frame rate. Maybe it does for you, but for me personally, I like it on max performance, and it also makes the guns and your gloves and your hands look a little bit better, adds that little bit of shadow depth to it. And at the end of the day, it's just personal preference. I think from the visual standpoint, if you want to get that competitive edge, you might want to turn it off, and you also get more frames out of it, obviously. But for me personally, I like that little bit of extra visuals on my gun and my hands specifically, so I'm going to put it on max performance, take that little bit of a performance hit, but also get a better looking game. Anisotropic filtering essentially deals with textures that are facing you at an angle. So for example, the floor ahead of you, the road, some of the sides of cliffs, for example. Any texture that is not facing you straight on sometimes looks blurry because this setting is turned off. So if you turn it to per texture, it lets the game decide which textures it renders at a higher quality, so it looks more sharper, but it comes at a cost of around 10 frames for me personally. And compared to on, which renders every single texture in sight at a higher detail, it's around 20 frames compared to off, or more like 16 frames, I should say. Myself personally, I've always used per texture, as I don't really stop just to look at the textures at an angle, because if you're running around, or you're moving around, I should say, you don't really notice the detail on the walls or on the road ahead of you. If you don't have the frames to spare, consider going off, or if you want slightly better looking game, go with per texture. But if you want the best looking game, then on is definitely the best option, but it comes at a cost of around 16 frames when I was testing it. Moving on to an Nvidia Reflex low latency, as you can see, it is grayed out. It is because I have disabled the game FPS limit. Usually I wouldn't recommend this, and I think most of you probably watching this video can hit the FPS limit regardless. You're not really worried about it. Nvidia Reflex low latency, it doesn't have any impact on your visuals or frame rate, but it does reduce the rendering lag. So my recommendation would be to use on or on plus boost. Up to you. I usually use on plus boost, and that is that. Moving on to sharpness, once again personal preference. When you use Nvidia DLSS, it does give it a little bit of a washed feeling, so sharpness can counter that. I personally use 0.9, as you can see, but at the end of the day, this is completely personal preference. Moving down to the settings on the bottom, the only one I'm going to demonstrate here is the high quality color. As you can see, the difference between off and on is almost 40 frames, and even though it does make the colors higher quality, it is most certainly not worth the dip in the frame rate. So my recommendation would be to leave it off. C-blur, chromatic aberrations, noise, I would 100% never check these, leave them off. And obviously, Streets of Tarkov lower texture resolution modes, I still feel like that's a must because it makes the Streets of Tarkov more playable. And it does obviously come at a cost of lower textures. And with the launch of 1.0, Volumetric Lighting now has quality options. Before it was just a check mark. To be fair though, the difference between low, medium and high and ultra, I don't really see a massive difference. If anything, it kind of looks worse on higher settings because it makes the lights dimmer a little bit, or the light rays, I should say. But the FPS difference between off and low is around 7-8 frames, and then low to high, it's like 1 or 2 frames tops. Ultra is another like 5-6 frames on top of it, so my recommendation is use either low or medium, as in my opinion the visual quality is not that much better, so I'm gonna keep those few extra frames, but I will get a little bit of a better looking game with the volumetric lighting on either low or medium. Moving on to SSR, which is screen space reflection, obviously handles reflections. The difference between off, low, medium is 10 frames between each setting, up to high as well, and then high and ultra is around 2 to 3 frames. Sometimes it has no impact. It really depends on the area you're in and how many reflections it has to handle. But it also gives you a little bit of an advantage in the visual side of things in darker areas as well. So if you look here, the difference between off and ultra, you can see the surfaces are a little bit brighter. So you can imagine in areas that are very dark, that slight increase in brightness on those textures on the walls and so on could be the difference between if you see a player crouching in a corner or not. So myself personally, I would recommend it on medium if you can afford the frame rate. I would not go to low because the low reflections, they look terrible. And between off and low, you lose about 10 frames. And honestly, in my opinion, I think off just looks better, as the low textures are honestly just distracting and they don't look very good. So if you're gonna use SSR, I think medium is the perfect spot. You don't have to go any higher than that. And once again, I certainly wouldn't recommend low. So for me personally, I am definitely gonna be using medium here. Alright, and we have finally made it to the good old PostFX. Just before we go into the PostFX and I show you my preferred settings, I just quickly want to go over the settings that affect your frame rate here. So the first thing is clarity. As you can see on the top right, we have 182, 187. If I turn it to 1 or 2, I drop about 10 to 15 frames. It doesn't matter if you have clarity on 1 or 100, the FPS change is the same. And the next setting that affects your FPS here is adaptive sharpen. And once again, it doesn't matter if it's... So take a look at the top right, 186, 180. Turn it up a little bit, drop to lower 170s. So another 10, 12 frames or so. And once again, doesn't matter if you put it on 1 or 100. It's just, as soon as you use it, it takes that frame rate. So that is something to keep in mind. And also color grading and the color blind mode, both each take 2-3 frames. So that is also something to keep in mind. But these two are obviously not as FPS heavy as the adaptive sharpen and clarity. So let's start from the top. My personal preference on brightness is around 50. Though I have noticed in 1.0 some weather types, like every now and then you get this massive fog, and then in that case the 50 brightness might be a little bit too much, depending on what your Nvidia settings are. And also, sorry, I forgot about my Nvidia settings. I'll put them on the screen right now, so you can compare if you want. But you don't see the effects of that on the screen, just an FYI. And also your monitor settings obviously matter as well. So if you feel like the fog is a little bit too bright, then turn down brightness, 20, 30. But for now, I'm sticking with 50, as I haven't seen the fog too often. Saturation for me, I like to put it on 25, not too much, because we are going to be using colorfulness as well, and that will give us the most of the color in the screen here. One thing I do really like is clarity. I'm going to lose about 10 to 15 frames, but as you can see, it improves clarity. It makes everything a little bit sharper. As you can see here, the detail on the floor there, obviously I'm using SSR, so that detail is more apparent, but compared to 0 and like 100 over there, it kind of pops up the shadows or like the brighter areas as well, which I really like. And colorfulness, I like it on 60. I know a lot of people like the grimy, darkish look of Tarkov, and I respect that, but for the sake of me, I like to record, and in order to get better quality videos, I need as much detail as possible to capture. So for me, I want to get that colorfulness in there as well. Luma sharpen, I put it to 20 to get that little bit of extra sharpness. As you can see, I don't know how well that translates through an encoded video, but you can see a little bit more detail on the floor and stuff. I really enjoy that. And since adaptive sharpen destroys frame rate, doesn't destroy, it's like 10 frames gone, right? I'm just gonna use Luma sharpen. Gets pretty much the same effect, but I don't lose any frames, as you can see on the top right. So I put that to 20. Also, you can use too much of it. I don't know how well you can see, but the shelves in the distance, they get kind of pixelated. It's like a little bit too much sharpness. You know what I mean? It's like this old painkiller effect. So 20 for me is the sweet spot. And color grading is the one thing that makes the biggest difference here. I personally have been using Clifton for years here, and I use it around 50 to 60, and you can see it gives that bluish tone, and for me that makes a huge difference in how the game looks. And I don't really like the greenish look, so for me, Clifton at 60, it makes the game look more realistic to me. Certainly makes it look a whole lot better. I also used to use Tritonopia on like 20, because it does improve. Like you can see the shadows on the ground here, it makes them a little bit brighter. You can go too much on this as well, like it makes it more washed. So if you want that little bit extra brightness, you can use it. Me personally, I haven't been using it for a little bit, but I have used it in the past, and it's not bad if you use it moderately. Like I said, too much, it kind of makes it washed. So up to you. Me personally, I'm going to stick it to none, because I don't feel like I need it at the moment. But the difference between the PostFX on and off, and as you can see, it's a huge difference. And the frame rate, we're at 190 right now. Turn it on, we drop to about 174, so we do lose a fair bit of frames, to be fair, but that's because of clarity, like I said, and obviously with the color grading combined as well. So that is something to keep in mind. But if you want to get roughly the same effect, you can just turn down the clarity to 0, and as you can see, you get a little bit extra frames, but it still looks good. Just me personally, I like the way clarity looks as well, and I have some frames to spare. So those are my PostFX. And this concludes our video. I hope you enjoyed, my friends. I hope you got some help in the visual side of things. I hope you get better frame rate. And I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.